Welcome to Commander Center episode 214, and today we're going to talk about winning Magic games by dealing damage outside the combat damage step. I'm Dana.
And I'm Chris.
Chris, it's just you and me.
I know, it's very different.
So Max and I have done episodes, and I think you and him did one without me at least, but I don't think you and I have ever done one with just the two of us before.
No, we have not.
Maybe this will go so well, Max is just going to be off the show. We're just going to boot him.
I don't know about that. It was quite amusing when you called me on Slack and he answers too. Or not on Slack, but Skype.
On Skype. Well, because just by default, like I clicked the group instead of setting up a separate chat just with you, and Max is like, hey guys. I'm like, oh, that's right. You can't make it right now. Max is dealing with some non-emergency family medical stuff, so he's unavailable today, so it's just going to be the two of us, but I think we will manage without him.
Oh yeah, definitely.
So how's life treating you? Anything special you want to mention before we get started here?
Not really. I mean, just
surviving?
Pretty much. It's like, there's like nothing to do. It's so boring.
Well, we have a ton of Magic stuff coming out, like, between Jumpstart and the core set, and we're now getting Double Masters, but half the stuff isn't available anywhere because of COVID, so you can't necessarily go buy it. The shop is like at weird hours because of it, so despite having a ton of Magic content out there, it's kind of tough to enjoy it right now too.
That is true. I did go in and play Modern last week, and it was very awkward.
I bet.
Masks required. You don't sit next to people. For me, since I have bad eyesight, having the mask up next to my eyes was actually hard to see my cards in my hand, so I had to hold my hand out farther in front of me, and it was just different.
How is the Modern, we won't get into this too far because this is obviously a Commander show, but how is the Modern meta right now? I know like in the last 6 months or even since Modern Horizons, it's been an absolute like turnover. Is it fun or is it just frustrating?
From what I saw, it was pretty much the same as what it was when I was playing before, because cards came out, but then cards got banned, and then there's not a whole lot of tournaments, so people aren't really playing Modern per se, so it's just kind of stale.
That makes sense. I suppose like when there isn't COVID stuff going on, people jam so many games, it's much easier to like perfect something, whereas right now it's probably a little more almost Wild West because people just are playing less. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes complete sense.
And then again, we've just had, multiple new sets that dropped, so that always shakes things up a little bit too.
Oh, of course.
Interesting.
That's so good. I went and got my playset of Azusas and Ugins the other day.
Nice.
So good.
Well, you didn't record when we talked about the core set. I think Max and I said this, and I think we said it on the EDH Recast too. Is this the best core set in, I don't know, in memory? Like I couldn't myself think of one. What were your thoughts on it?
This is definitely the best one in memory.
I mean,
aside from Origins, I think that just set a precedent that I don't think anything is going to come close to, but it's pretty good. The
reprints were amazing. There's a bunch of great new cards too. When we all started playing Commander, that was like, M13, M14, M15, which were some pretty rough years for core sets. So I guess maybe that's the bar in my head for some reason I always think of as core sets. So when we get stuff like Origins was amazing compared to those, and now the last couple of years they seem to have really figured it out.
Yeah, I know. I have been talking to people on our team and they actually are upset with the core set reprints due to the fact that it's actually hurting Standard. Because, now Ugin's legal again.
Oh, sure.
You have Azusa and Ugin legal together. And, I mean, just like the decks are becoming all the same type of deck, just different colors.
Because there's just so many absolute bomb cards in there.
Yes.
Plus things like, Uro and
Yep.
Yeah. It's like playing mod. It's like the strongest power level Standard has been in a long time. It's insane.
Yes.
Based on what I've seen. And of course, hey, Wilderness Reclamation. How could that have gone wrong?
Well, at least there's not like super broken cards like there are in Modern that you can break with that card. So
right, that's true. It's not quite as painful. Okay, so that's enough non-Commander talk. We will.
Speaking of Commander, I'm gonna put this out here right now. So Mr. Dana here decided we're gonna record today at noon. And then he said some work stuff came up. So you know what he did to me? He made me start tweaking my Mogus deck. Anyone who ends up playing with me is going to be much, much worse.
It's my fault that Chris was sitting there like bored for 15 minutes. Like, I guess I'm going to make this deck meaner.
Yep.
Well, we'll actually talk about the Mogus deck here a little bit because that was one of the things that kind of inspired this. We knew it was going to be you and I, and we both have decks that win with damage, but it's not combat damage. So
Yep.
So this made for a good topic, but we'll get into that in here just a few minutes. If somebody out there listening in listener land would like to reach out to us and say, hey, how would they do that, Chris?
You can find us on multiple social media outlets. We'll start with Twitter, where you can find us at CMDR Central. You can search us up on Facebook, CMDR Central. You can find us online at cmdrcentral.com. And you can also find us on patreon.com/CMDR Central.
Absolutely. And we have an announcement we'll do next week. We're going to do it this week, but Max is out, so we'll wait till he's back. We have a couple giveaways. We actually got a bunch of cool cards sent to us by a listener, so we will announce the specifics of that. We're going to give out to supporters and listeners. In addition to that, we got an artist to make us some cool stuff, too, that we will go into more detail on next week as well.
Oh, I can't wait to talk about that.
Yeah, that's super cool.
I've been keeping it in the dark. I haven't told anybody, nice. So it's been really hard on me.
Oh, it turned out so nice.
It did.
So we'll do that next week, too, because I want Max here for that. So we'll mention that as well. But I wanted to tease both of those two things a little bit once all three of us are back and in the house. I think that's about it if we want to jump into this main topic. You ready for it?
Let's do this.
All right. So the most common ways people win games of Commander are with combat damage or through combo. Exquisite Blood, Sanguine Bond, and that's a damage outside of combat, but it's infinite and just wins the game. One of the things we wanted to talk about was not just the instant win non-combat damage, but like ways you can win the game. I wouldn't call it chip damage, but like oftentimes when people are winning in combat damage, they're hitting somebody for, 8-1 turn, 10-1 turn, 12, then they eventually win the game. You can win games that way too with non-combat damage. And the reason this is kind of relevant, I mentioned that Chris and I both have decks that do that, but it's the kind of thing I've been looking at a little bit more too as over the years I've gone from having 5 decks to 6 decks to 8 decks, whatever. And as I've gotten more decks, I've tried to find ways to make sure those decks win games in ways that are different than another deck I have, just to keep things interesting.
Yeah, it would get stale, wouldn't it, if you had the same deck doing the same thing? And
right, yeah. Particularly if it's just via beats, and I love turning creatures sideways. That's a lot of fun, but like the difference between a Sphinx tribal deck and a Dragon tribal deck is not much difference, right? With how they play out. So I've been trying to look at different ways to deal that damage when I'm playing games. So the best place to talk about this here maybe is to quick start with talking about our 2 decks that win with damage, and it's not combo damage, but it's not combat damage either. So let's begin talking about your Mogus deck a little bit, Chris. You've had this for 4 or 5 years now, I would bet, when we think about it.
Quite a long time. It's one of my first decks that I made, so
what made you want to build Mogus?
Basically, Rakdos is my preferred color combination, and I don't remember who I was running to begin with. I think it was Master of Cruelties or something like that.
Okay.
Because I wanted that weird, like, oh, I hit you, you're down to 1 or whatever, like weird shenanigans type of thing.
Sure.
And someone mentioned to me about Mogus, because he had just come out, I think, like a set prior to when I built the Master of Cruelties deck. So I looked into him, got him, and I'm like, sweet, you know what this is going to turn into? World of Warcraft. And this is where I'm going with this. When you go into a raid in World of Warcraft, you have that set amount of people that do AoE damage, which is area of effect damage. So I wanted to do that where it was straight up, okay, there's 3 people in the pod. How can I deal damage to each of them simultaneously, but not like draw a huge target on me?
Mm-hmm.
So, and this is the route that I took. Now, you could go, a lot of people like split their attacks, to even it out. Like, okay, I'll hit each of you guys for 1. Well, why not just not attack at all and just be like, you guys all take 2. What are you going to do now? Mwahaha.
And everyone takes the 2.
Yes.
No one's, occasionally someone will be like, well, I have a, skull clamp on a 2/2 zombie. I'll sacrifice that. Yep. But like 95% of the time, it's just damage everyone's taking every upkeep.
Yeah, or someone flips Sigarda, and I'm like, yeah, this is going to be wonderful.
Right. Occasionally that happens, but by and large, you just start taking the damage. And we talk about how in Commander you can afford to take damage. You can if you're getting something for it. Like, you can trade your life for cards. For example, that's not a huge deal in Commander. It's relatively easy to take 8 to draw 2 off a Sylvan Library. It's a whole different thing to just constantly take damage and get nothing for it. that's much more difficult to do. I always feel like it's like putting a new roof on your house. When you get a new kitchen or like put new appliances in your kitchen or something, you can at least use them.
Yep.
That doesn't feel nearly as bad as putting a new roof on where you're like, oh, I guess my house just doesn't leak. Which is good. Like you need that, but it doesn't feel good at all. And it's the
not
same
even
thing.
Something you can admire neither.
Right. Well, like trading damage for cards is fine. Trading damage to just take damage every turn all the time is a whole different deal. And you're also not like getting cards that can deal with that response. You're just losing life. And it's only 2, but it's only 2 until you factor in, until the Mana Barbs comes out and until the, like what other cards in the deck do you have that do a lot of work there for you?
So the big thing that this deck revolves around is like the Mogus effect, where it's 2 damage to everybody. But in order to make this more powerful, you need the damage doublers. So then it becomes 4 damage. Then you throw in cards like Sulfuric Vortex, which does the same thing, but it prevents life gain. So then people can't gain that life back. Or you put in cards like Spell Shock. People cast a spell, any type of spell, they get hit for 2 damage. Now, I mean, we can make this even worse, and we go into like Havoc Festival, where at the beginning of the upkeep, it just, guess what? You lose half your life. Boom, what's up? So basically, that's like how the entire thing works. And now, like you said, Mana Barbs is pretty cool card to play in, but it hurts you too. So when I personally built this deck, I found a card that just came out that actually plays well with Mana Barbs, and that is Fires of Invention. So it allows you to, not tap your lands to cast spells. So you just cast equal to whatever the lands you control. So you dodge your Mana Barbs, which then hurts everybody else in the long run.
And you're also in Rakdos, where like you're not obviously ramping lands like the green player. You tend to be running a lot more Mana Rocks are your form of ramp, which also don't hurt you. Whereas the green player, who they tend to run way less rocks because they're ramping out lands, that also like punishes them in a way it doesn't really punish you.
Yep. Now, what I like about Fires of Invention personally with this deck is a lot of mistakes I've seen players make is that they overextend. Like, I'm going to cast 5 spells this turn, and it's like, whoa. No, you should cast 1 to 2 at the most. And this card actually limits you to doing that. Yeah,
it slows the game down while everyone's simultaneously taking damage from Mogus and from the other effects you have out there too.
Yes, there are many other cards like Chandra, the Chandras. Chandra Awaken Inferno is a card that I wanted to talk about too, because she gives an emblem to your opponents that deals 1 damage at the beginning of their upkeep, which you can't get rid of, which is what you're looking for in any of these types of decks, is something that they can't physically get rid of that just keeps hitting them for damage repeatedly upon repeatedly, which is perfect.
Plus, then even if you get knocked out of the game, you're still part of the game, kind of.
Yep, you just sit back and go, haha, you died to that emblem. I still beat you.
Nice. So this deck is a lot of times a good one that you play like when we're at the shop and it's 11:30 or something, and we're like, well, I guess we can squeeze 1 more in.
Yep.
Because it puts a cap on the game. The game is going to end in 20 minutes, pretty much no matter what happens.
Yep. I also like playing this when sometimes we do a pot of 6 or something, and this is a nice deck to play for that.
Speed things up there too, because those games can be absolute slogs, for sure. So my kind of version of this a little bit, and it's not, your Mogus deck is very much almost entirely based around doing damage.
Yes.
Outside the combat step. I do have plenty of combat damage in my Veil of the Nightclad deck, but one of the secondary win conditions in that deck is the multiple different Tezzerets that do damage based on the amount of artifacts I control.
And you want to know what's ridiculous about that? I don't know how many times I've sat down and played with you, and you play Tezzeret, and I'm like, we're going to die to that. And everyone ignores it. And I'm like,
It's like 2 turns direct. Everyone take 16, and I'll gain 16. So that has it as a secondary win condition, but I actually have 2 other decks that primarily win with damage that's not combat-based. First is my Kresh deck that primarily deals damage via fling effects, so it's a +1 counters deck, and it makes a lot of big beater creatures that tend to not have trample, so people also then are like, does that have trample? No, you have no trample enablers. Okay, I'm fine for a turn. And then I can fling that 22 non-trampling, whatever creature it happens to be, I can fling it to do 22 damage to somebody. So that Kresh deck very, very rarely does anything ever turn sideways.
That is next level thinking there. Let's just make sure the creature doesn't have trample or any scary keywords, so then everyone forgets.
Well, kind of, yeah. Right. That's very much intentional. And then my most recent deck I built was the new Athreos from the last Theros set, and that's a Pestilence deck. So I have Pestilence and Withering Wisps and Pestilence Demon, and there's I think it's Plague Rats that have a Pestilence effect, Thrashing Wumpus. So there's like half a dozen different effects that basically do, spend a black mana, do damage to all creatures and players. And then I have a bunch of things in there that make it so I don't take damage outside of the combat step. So I can pump 10 mana into there. If I have a Cabal Coffers out, maybe even more, deal damage to everybody and take none myself.
Which is really good.
Yeah, and it's also like, again, it's a deck that and then because what the deck runs, I can run a bunch of creatures, or a bunch of effects and spells and creatures that I would never run in any other deck. So it gives it a unique identity from other decks I'm playing.
Now, with that deck, do you run into the issue where you have all the Pestilence outlets, but no way of protecting yourself, so you end up killing yourself as well?
Not really. A much bigger factor there is not having a Pestilence effect.
Okay.
Or like I draw one and someone blows it up, and then I'm like, well, I better hope I find another one here, or I don't have any way to mount an offense.
Okay.
So that's a little bit bigger issue. I feel like the deck just needs one or two more. And I guess I could run tutors, but I don't want to run too many tutors as well. I have, I think, 2 in there right now, and I don't want to turn it into a 7 tutor deck so I can get them consistently either. So one thing I did do recently is I actually put Karma in there that deals damage to people based on the amount of swamps they control. And between Urborg to give everyone swamps, and that kind of acts as like a 7th Pestilence effect, because then I don't take damage. There's probably like 8 or 9 different ways that prevents damage to me.
Yep.
So then I don't take damage from it either. So that I think is going to help. So I'll continue to tweak that deck. But that's been a lot of fun just because it lets me do things in a very non-traditional way in terms of dealing damage in games.
Yep. It kind of reminds me of the Indestructible Angel that flips, Avacyn, that you try building her, similar to that.
Yeah, with repercussion kind of effects and stuff. There was not nearly enough there. At least I couldn't get the balance right. But yeah, very, very similar. And actually, that's one of the decks we'll kind of talk about as we go down this list about ones we don't have, but that you see people play. And so the first one I will mention, if you're looking to build something that deals damage outside the combat damage step, you see the big black mana decks out there quite often that are running things like a Sanguinate or Drain Life or Consume Spirit. Basically, they tend to be mono black. They make a ton of black mana because there's a bunch of things in black that do that. Cabal Coffers, Cabal Stronghold. There's all the doublers, the Gauntlets, and Caged Sun. But black has creature doublers too, like Nirkana Revenant or Cryptghast. So those black decks can make a ton of mana and throw it all into a big Exsanguinate or a big Drain Life. But they also tend to run things like Grey Merchant or Kokushko or Tormented Hailfire. So you can, if you are interested in doing that, even without doing like multiple Grey Merchant bounces for like infinite merchant damage, you can run just a big black mana Drain Life deck and have that be really, really effective. I've seen that deck, and I had a variant on it myself with Draina years ago. There's black-white versions of it, too, that run extort kind of effects. But like that's a legit way to win games.
Yeah, that's pretty good. Yeah, I was just thinking about that Draina deck that you had. The upside to that deck, whereas you're talking about just making like a basic black, whatever deck, is that Draina also has the ability to pump into her to make her a lethal killer. So that like right there in your command zone, you have a creature that if you're making a ton of mana, you can just, if you get desperate, that's a backup plan, then put her in play. She has evasion because she has flying. I'm going to pump, 14 mana into Draina this turn and just dome somebody. Yep. The downfall I see to decks like this, aside from running Grey Merchant, Torment, or Sanguinate, is most of their other X spells are just single target. So you're not getting multiple hits. Which kind of puts a target on you. It's like, okay, I'm going to drain life this guy for 50. Oh, I gained 50 life, and now immediately the other two players are like, whoop, you're going to go down. And then it's a one-use effect, so like you have to hope you draw another one or have a way to recur that one or something. Like if you that Sanguinate feels great, or the drain life feels great or something, but like if you don't have ways to do it again next turn, then things get tricky. Yep, so you got to kind of play around that. And you bet. I don't envy the person who tries to do it. So aside from the black stuff, we also got red damage. Now, everybody knows red is the key color to just shooting someone in the face. That's just how it works. It always has been. Now, you got cards like Fireball. So we go back way, way, way back. I do believe this was original alpha, beta. They had Fireball, and a wonderful spell called Channel, where you're just like, oh, suck my life and kill you.
Game over before you can play Magic.
Yeah, this is how it all started. So you got all sorts of nice red stuff. Now you can start splashing other colors, which gives you like Riku, Melek, Mizzet, Niv-Magus, so you get other stuff where you can cast those other spells, which also leads to other additional win cons, such as let's talk about Mizzet, where you can go blue X spells to mill people, which is another, off-the-wall mill condition, or win condition.
Max had this Mizzet deck for a while, and a lot of times that was his thing, was like a earthquake effect where he could hit everyone for damage if he was ahead, or just a fireball. A lot of times he just used like those X damage fireball kind of spells in that Mizzet deck where he would have 10 or 12 counters on it, and he, in addition to the mana he had, just shoot somebody for like 24 with a fireball.
Yep, and the other stuff about red that a lot of people probably forget too is, or even blue, is you have ways to double the spell.
Yeah.
Where I can't even think of the name of the cards, but I know you can like cast it, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh, I'm gonna copy the spell and I'm gonna shoot it at you and all that stuff.
So the obvious ones, you have like High Tide, which, sees even Legacy play because it's so good for doubling that mana. But like Mana Geyser in red, where you add a red to your mana pool for each tapped land your opponents control. If it's like turn 10 or something, if someone doesn't have a counter spell, Mana Geyser is going to make you like 25 mana sometimes.
Yeah, and then you like reverberate it and double the spell.
Yeah. Like that's a legit deck if you're playing, especially if you're playing one of those commanders that can then copy it or something.
Yes.
I mean, you can do that. That's a legit Spellslinger variant that you can do without having to combo or go infinite. You can absolutely kill people with that style, for sure.
The hard part about a deck like that, though, especially if you're doing like main red, because I play Torbrand mono red too sometimes.
Okay.
And the hardest part about that is that the equaling of spells to creatures. Because you want to be heavy spells, but then you have nothing to protect yourself with the creature base. So then you kind of run into that issue where if you run into like a token deck or something, they can swarm over you and you just cannot play fast enough to do anything. Yeah,
you just have to hope you draw board wipes at the right time or you're just in trouble. Kind of a variant on that in red, modern decks play Valkut.
Oh, I sure do. Give me prime time and Commander.
You bet. Well, and you have 4 of them there, plus you have the tutors to get them. It's a little bit trickier in Commander.
Yes.
But like Golos, as in your command zone, will just go get you a Valkut. If you want to build a deck around it, you can get it consistently with that commander.
Yep.
And I have a Valkut in my Mina and Den deck, and it's not my main win condition necessarily, but it's won me plenty of games when I've just top decked it and been like, oh, there's 9 lands in my graveyard, and I have Escape Shift. Well, I guess I'm probably going to be okay if I draw down, hit Splendor Reclamation or something, and I can Escape Shift some more out, and it's a solid win condition, and now that we have Golos, it's much easier to actually have that be a main part of your deck.
Yeah, Golos is... I do believe he is the number 1 commander on EDH Rec right now.
Yeah, it's been popping back and forth between Golos and Muldrotha, but yeah, absolutely. Because you have that. I think I've seen that Valkut deck. There's that Golos Gates deck I've seen people build. But almost anything, we actually just did a show we recorded that won't even have aired by the time this one comes out, where we went over decks on the EDH Recast that have the most different themes. So like what commander has the most different like style decks people can build with it. And I think Golos was number 1 by a large margin, because there's, the Valkut deck and there's the Gates deck. And then basically any kind of deck you want to build, Golos is still going to be good. Like whatever you want to do for 5 color, being able to go get lands is
and
never bad.
Activate him and just like start playing cards for free. I mean, it's really good.
For sure. So that makes things like that much more viable than it once was. I mentioned my Fling deck, which is what I use Kresh for, but Brian Stoutarm and Gerard Lichlord basically do Fling effects. Mm-hmm. And we have fight decks too. Naiath of the Dire Hunt, Gargos, Vicious Watcher, Ayula, Queen Among Bears. Those tend to fight creatures, but they don't have to. Gerard does damage directly to players. Brian does damage to one single player. So you can absolutely work that into a deck too if you want to have your creatures deal that damage outside the command zone that's a legit way to play. I won plenty of games with Brian Stoutarm when I was playing that deck.
Oh, I remember that deck. First time you sat down with him, I'm like, what is going on? Okay, so you can fling stuff. So what are you going to fling in these colors off since like active trees? And I'm like, oh no.
And take your stuff and throw it back at you. Or like Malingus, where it deals half of someone's, it comes into play like with half someone's life total and then just throw it at them. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of cool stuff you can do. Gerard hits everybody for damage, so it's not really a fling, but like it just deals damage when you sacrifice the creature, and it's everybody, so that's brutal too.
Well, you combine that with any aristocrat deck, and then you're
absolutely
getting double triggers, triple triggers. It's just
and yeah, you don't have to necessarily like just commit to one of these strategies. Aristocrat decks, there's absolutely decks where that's the main strategy, where they're just building as many like blood artist kind of effects as possible in the deck. That doesn't have to be your only win condition. I've seen plenty of Marin decks where they do aristocrat stuff, and they're also swinging at you with beater creatures. It's like their second win con, but if you want that to be all you do, that's pretty viable in Teysa Karloff or the new Kel's Fight Fixer deck. Aristocrats are really difficult to deal with too.
Yes.
I mean, you can remove creatures, but they like want you to do that.
Yes, they want them gone. And the other upside to like the aristocrats is majority of it's in black, so that leads us back to the big black mana that we were talking about. You can make all that, and then all of a sudden be like, oh, so I got you guys all down to 10. I'll just exsanguinate for the win. Cool.
Yeah, right. You combine whatever pieces work best for you, because they do tend to synergize well. If you're doing one bit of out of combat damage, why not throw in a second way to do it too? Particularly if it kind of synergizes with the first one. There's a lot of ways to mix and match these different effects for sure, and they're effective. I've lost to a lot of different aristocrats decks, or kind of a variant on that. The new Sir Conrad that was in the set last fall, Eldraine, Joey Schultz on the EDH Recast built a Sir Conrad deck that is so frustrating. Because a lot of that stuff, like if you don't have immediate instant speed graveyard removal, there's so many spells you can cast in that deck that just bring things back, and then everyone on the table takes lethal damage.
Yes.
Like playing that deck on stream, one thing we've really found out is you can't let Sir Conrad be in play if he's got any way to put stuff in his graveyard, or you just take so much damage it's just over.
Yeah, that's I play Sir Conrad in my Alessia deck, so I get some
of the
bonuses.
Yeah.
It's not quite as good as being built around him, but just having the ability to use that type of effect is huge.
Well, and that's a good point. We talked about combining different kinds of out of combat damage, but like that Alessia deck is primarily a combat damage based deck, but there's no reason you have to like go all the way either. If you are chipping somebody for half a dozen damage to the face with the combat swings in Alessia, you don't have to just do that. You can absolutely hit them for a half a dozen more when something comes out of your graveyard because of Sir Conrad. Why not combine both of those two things?
Well, yeah, that's something that we talk about a lot, is when you build your deck, don't build it narrow. You got to build it broad and have many outs when you're playing the game.
Because it's become so much more difficult to stop what you're doing if your deck is designed to go that many different directions.
Yep.
Because I think we've all seen that situation where someone has that deck that's entirely built around the graveyard, and someone opens with a Leyline in the Void. You're like, oh, I'm just screwed. I'm just done.
When I was playing Modern this week, I played against our store owner, and I was playing Storm, and he went turn 1 Nihil Spellbomb. I forced him to crack it. He got rid of my graveyard so I couldn't redo all the stuff on my graveyard. And immediately his next turn he played Leyline in the Void, and I'm just like, oh, I hate my life so bad right now.
yeah, man, that's rough to deal with. If that's all you're trying to do, that's something that for sure can get shut down. Another good one in this is a deck that I guess people tend to think of Nekuzar to be a combo deck. It's not really a combo deck, though. I guess it can be, but it feels that way because it winds up being like Wheel of Fortune into Winds of Change, into Tolarian Winds, into Everyone's Dead. But that's out of combat damage. Like that. That's a deck built around dealing damage to people for drawing cards, and then you just force them to draw cards.
Yeah, and like whenever I played against a Nekuzar deck, I don't ever quite think of it as combo per se, because they don't just go infinite. They're not just like bloom bloom, I win. No, it's more of a okay, I play this, and then they wheel and they look at their hand and they're like, oh, I can't do anything. Pass the turn. And you're like, oh, you are dead now.
it for sure isn't an automatic thing because and they're also mana constrained.
Yes.
So like they cast that first wheel and hope they hit one that's efficient or cheap, because there are some that are expensive. And if you hit, that Reforge the Soul is great if you draw it
right
as
away.
your card for the turn. But if you draw it off your wheel, that's way less effective if you've only got 4 mana free or something.
Yes.
So yeah, no, I agree. It definitely doesn't feel like a combo deck, although people sometimes act like it is. But yeah, that's a perfect example. I guarantee of all the Nekusar games I've lost to Nekusar, I don't even know if I've ever taken like combat damage from it. It's all that wheel damage.
Yeah, I don't think I ever have neither.
Yeah.
Although I've never been mad at a Nekusar player neither. No. You know, like, okay, you're wheeling me. I'm like, ooh, more cards. Woohoo.
Yeah. Yep. And there's a couple of different variants on that. I've seen Niv Mizzet versions of that deck too, but kind of the same thing. Psychosis Crawler does a lot of damage, but it can totally be effective.
Yep.
I guess I would call these pain decks, and I would maybe put your Mogus deck in this category where your people are taking damage based on doing their things. Rurik Thar is the one that always jumps out at me.
You know,
Take 6 damage for casting a non-creature spell.
Yeah, and I haven't seen an actual deck built around Rurik Thar in years. I've seen him in decks, but I've never actually seen him built around him.
I feel like part of that reason is whenever years ago, when someone would like flip over their commander and like, look, I'm playing Rurik Thar, everyone's head simultaneously like turns. Like, oh. So you're the person we're all going to try to kill before you have 6 mana to play your commander.
Yep.
Because like once that comes down, it's the same thing. You're like, okay, well, it's going to take 6 damage to remove it once. No one wants to be the person who deals with that. You definitely can't cast. Like at 6 damage, you can't be casting many spells.
No.
One of them better be a removal spell pretty quickly. So I think that's probably the reason. If it comes out of your deck in the 99, no one sees it coming, and they're like, well, I guess we got to deal with it. But when it's your commander, and they're like, oh, I know what's up. Yeah, that's what I almost guarantee you. I would love to hear from any listeners who had a Rurik Thar deck that they took it apart. I would almost guarantee that reaction is why they took it apart.
It would be amusing just to build one, but never actually like cast him. You build you build the colors and you just go a different route with the deck completely just to see how people react to just the commander.
They're like, oh, what's going on here? What's happening? Yeah, I feel like they'd still be like, I don't want to take the chance. We're still killing you.
I'm gonna play Rurik Thar Goblins or something.
Right? Maybe. Yeah. Right. Yeah. The goblins are coming like, what is happening? That would be pretty funny. You mentioned Archangel Avacyn, and there's different variants on the Repercussion deck. Repercussion is a card from the Urza block where when a creature takes damage, it deals damage to its controller.
Yep.
I've seen multiple different decks kind of built around this effect, running Repercussion or Arc Bond or something where the deck is designed to deal damage to creatures and have those creatures then deal damage back to their controller. And there's various ways in the deck to prevent that damage to yourself, particularly because Archangel Avacyn is playing white, and white has ways to dodge damage. So that's a deck that there's different variants somebody can build. And I guess I would call this maybe a variant as well. One of the decks, when I got to play on stream with Sheldon Menery, he had a deck called the You're Hurting Yourself deck. And it was all damage reflecting spells for the most part, like Deflecting Palm or Comeuppance or stuff. So his win condition was people trying to hurt him or other players and him reflecting that damage back on them.
I don't think I've ever seen
Stop Hitting Yourself deck. It was fantastic.
I've seen people cast Deflecting Palm in Commander, and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't.
Yeah.
But like a whole deck built around that would be awesome. Yeah.
It was super, super cool. And again, it's a weird, unique thing that like no one else in your shop is going to have a deck like that. That was a very cool one to actually square off and go against.
Indeed.
And I think the last one that kind of jumps out at me here is Firesong and Sunspeaker, which is that deck where it converts life gain into damage.
Yes, which is very interesting because you would think that this should be a black-white mechanic, but it's a red-white mechanic.
Yeah. Yeah, which it kind of makes sense. I can see the Boros Legion, I guess, that is a little bit consistent. And that deck, that's really the only deck that does that for the most part. And a lot of the spells, it's not the most unique deck.
No.
From the next Firesong and Sunspear, like they all tend to look the same. But it's a unique way to play anyway. Like no other commander's really doing things that way.
That would be... Can you imagine writing your life total? Oh, I go up, I go down. I go up, I go down. You go down.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing, too. Sometimes that first spell goes off when you're not ready for it, and they gain 140 life or something. You're like, oh, man, I don't know how I'm ever going to cut through that now.
Commander damage.
Yeah, that's your option.
Yep, that's the hard part about decks like this. So I'm going to lump all these decks into the one category of they deal with pretty much damage to the life total.
Yeah.
So the hardest part is when you run into those life gain decks where they're gaining so much life, because a lot of the generals that you play, aside from like Draina that we were talking about earlier, you can't really get commander damage through with them. They're meant to be a piece of the puzzle that just deals a whole bunch of damage. So you actually run into that issue a lot.
That becomes the downside. Then what are you going to do? Like have in your Raikou of 2 reflections fireball deck? That's great until the person gains 300 life off some stupid thing, and then you're like, oh, I'm literally never going to be able to cut through that, and I'm certainly not going to be able to get through with Raikou over the course of 12 turns to deal commander damage. That's definitely one downside here.
Yep, I have personally ran into this with playing against you, actually. When I play against your Jeru deck and you play the Wanderer, which prevents, non-combat damage or something like that.
Right.
So, it just turns the whole deck right off, and you're just like, what do I do here? So, I mean, that's why you gotta, when you build a deck something like this, think about what's going to turn your deck off and prevent you from doing anything, and look at ways that you could add to that deck to stop those things from doing it.
Well, and that might be a good show down the road for us to do, is talk about like different deck archetypes and what cards you can run in your deck to deal with things that might turn your deck off. So that's actually not a bad idea. But just in general, for sure, if you are going this route, you need to be aware that things like the Wanderer are going to shut you down. Or, there's a lot of spells in my Pestilence deck that do the same thing. The Wanderer is one of them in there. Mark of Asylum prevents non-combat damage. That's another one. Most people aren't generically running those.
Yes. But
you never know when they are. And if you butt heads with somebody who's doing the same thing as you and you shut both, you each shut each other down, which absolutely is the kind of thing that can happen sometimes.
Yep, it is.
So that gets really, really tricky as well. And the problem with these kinds of decks too, it's always tough to make cuts to a deck. You want, X amount of ramp and X amount of draw and removal and some graveyard hate and some ramp. Once you build your 100 cards out, then, the new set comes out, you're trying to make cuts. You're like, I don't know what to play. Like, that gets tricky in the best of circumstances. And that's with a quote-unquote normal deck. If you're running something like this, like we'll use that Pestilence deck of mine, for example, where in addition to having all the usual things you run, I have half a dozen slots devoted to Pestilence effects and another like 8 to 10 devoted to cards that keep me from taking damage. Those are all slots that most decks don't have to deal with. So I have to sacrifice something somewhere else. And in that particular deck, I'm running like 9 creatures or 8 creatures. It might even be less than that. So I don't have a ton of creatures out, so I tend to eat a bunch of chip damage early because I don't have any blockers out for the most part. That's another downside here. You have to be aware that to do a lot of these things, it's going to require you to change the actual construction of your deck in a way that's going to present challenges. I'll put it that way.
Yep. I also notice with decks like this, personally, like with my Mogus deck, is don't force things out to become the archenemy.
Yes.
You got to slowly slide things out. For instance, I'll cast Mogus early on and just let him sit, and I won't start jamming more stuff. It's just oh, you guys just take 2, and then everyone gets used to that, and all of a sudden it's oh, now you take 3 a turn, and they're like, okay, that's fine. And it just slowly escalate it until the point where you can just be blam, blam, blam. Okay, now you guys have to stop me.
Well, and that's another good point, right? These decks are going to tend to play with different rhythms than your average turn creature sideways deck or, a control combo deck or something. And you have to maybe get used to those rhythms. They're not worse, but you have to change your playstyle a little bit for sure.
Yeah.
And you're absolutely right. When you play that Mogus deck, that's 100% what you do. And even though I know you do that, I know that you play Mogus and you're okay, I'm just going to ride this for a few turns and I'm going to take a little bit of damage. It's still, mentally, I'm still it's only 2 damage.
Yep.
Chris is doing 2 to me with Mogus, and that's not great. But Max just played a Baneslayer Angel and a Asceticism in play, and I got to figure out how to deal with those 2 things. So I'm just going to take 2 damage for a couple turns while I deal with Max, and then that 2 damage is now 3, then it's 4. But that Baneslayer still, it's not going to deal with that.
Yep.
Finding that sweet spot where you can weave that damage in and do enough without having everyone realize, or even if they realize it, sometimes you still can't afford to deal with it because there's something that seems like a bigger threat.
Yeah.
So that's absolutely a play style thing for sure.
Yeah, I know when I play personally too, is I like to play the cards that make me lose life to draw cards and stuff like that. So it's like someone's like, "Oh, you're just hitting me for so much." I'm like, well, our life totals are the same. I mean,
no, but no, for real, that's actually, that makes sense, because you don't want to be necessarily the person at 40 life when everyone's at 20. That definitely draws attention to you. If you're the person at 20 when everyone else is at 20, even if the reason you're at 20 is because you've drawn a dozen cards off, between Phyrexian Arena and Ambition's Cost or whatever, psychologically, people still look around and see everyone's at 20.
Yep. I've done that with...
that makes a difference.
With Mana Barbs, for instance, where it's like, oh, I'm at like 30 life, and it's like, oh, I'm just going to take all this damage and play all these spells. And next thing you know, I'm at 10 life, and everyone's at 30, and they ignore you. They're just like, oh, he's pretty much dead anyways. And you're just like, haha, little do you know.
Yeah. The best is when someone says that, I probably should finish off Chris. He's low, but I'll give him one. Like, ha 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 ha. When they comment on it and still make the mistake, that feels so good.
Yep. I've seen it with you too, though, where you're at like 1 or 2 life and everyone's like, and then they look over, it's like, oh, but that's a huge threat. And I'm like, no, where's my lightning bolt? I gotta kill him right now.
Oh yeah, that feels great. So any final thoughts on this before we wrap it up here?
I guess my biggest final thought is, looking back at all this, majority of this stuff is within the color of red. So I know a lot of people do not like the color of red, but this is built, these types of decks are built around like that red or black color. Those two work wonderful for this type of deck scenario.
Yeah. Yep. And that's maybe one of the reasons I think people, if you're being if you're trying to play red like it's green, that's probably not going to work out for you. You need to understand every color has its own kind of vibe. And out of combat damage from red is one of those things.
Yep.
And maybe a lightning bolt isn't as effective in a 40 life format with 3 opponents as it is in a 20 life format with 1 opponent, but that doesn't mean there isn't ways to do it if you want to try to do something like this. There's a ton of ways we talked about, and I'm sure plenty more that we didn't even mention.
Oh, I'm sure there are cards that are buried in, the indexes of Magic that I have no clue about, that sometimes someone's going to bring and be like, what do you think about this card? And be like, oh, look at that, and it's going to get jammed in.
Well, in one of the reasons I put like Karma that I mentioned in that Pestilence deck. That's a legit strong card in the right circumstances. But the reason not that I didn't know Karma existed, but I wasn't really thinking about it. I was just going back through a bunch of old sets because I'm like, I knew Withering Wisps was a card and I knew Pestilence was a card. I'm like, are there other ones that I just didn't remember from like the Dark or Fallen Empires or whatever? So basically, I just filtered out the black and white cards from basically the first 10 years of Magic, and I just read down the list. I'm like, which ones of these would be useful? There's so many cards that you can stumble across that do these kind of weird things if you just go looking.
Yeah, I actually found one today when I was doing the tweaking on my Mogus deck that I'm going to go and pick up. It's called, and this is a new card. I can't believe I didn't even realize this. It's called Cryptolith Fragment. It's a 3-mana mana. It's a 3-mana mana rock that I do believe comes into play tapped. But whenever you tap it, taps for any color mana, and then each opponent or each player loses 1 life. And then it flips into a creature that I think it's whenever it attacks, each opponent loses 3 life or something like that.
Yeah, I think that was it from the second, the Shadows of Innistrad, or whatever the second one in that block was.
Yeah, because I was just flipping through looking at cards. And I'm like, why am I not running this?
It's perfect for my deck.
Yep.
Yeah, very cool. Just got to dig deep sometimes, and you can find all kinds of weird stuff out there. And some of it you can absolutely build a deck around, for sure.
Indeed.
All right. Well, Chris, that is going to, I think, wrap up our first Maxless show. I'm not sure we're ready to kick him off just yet, but I think that went pretty smooth.
I would have been really curious as to what Max's, interpretation of the stuff is, because I know he personally doesn't run a deck like this that I can think of.
He doesn't really. No. I think his Regnant and Krav deck does a little bit of Aristocrat stuff, and I think he was thinking about tweaking it a little bit more into a kind of extort style deck. So, because he was thinking about playing, the new black blue commander that was, I think, in Jumpstart, and the name is escaping me now. But he was afraid it was going to play too much like his Regnant and Krav deck, so he was looking at maybe tweaking that one a little bit to find room for it. So it'd be interesting to see what he has to say too, for sure. Because he tends to be a turning creature sideways guy for the most part.
Yep, as we call those people, they're windshield wipers, because it goes one way and then it goes back the other way. And
I like that. That's good. That's a good term. All right. That is going to wrap up episode 214. I'm Dana. You can find me on the Twitter birds at Dana Roach. You can find Max at CMDR_Max. And you can find Chris at WiseSquishy1. Our show was edited by Rafael Garcia. He's on Twitter at Ursa Bearwalker. And our podcast theme is Retro Future Dirty by Kevin MacLeod, licensed via Creative Commons. We will be back next week with Max. Until then, I am Dana.
And I'm Chris.